The Atlantic is black and endless, a moving desert of cold water and wind. It is early 1941. Somewhere between Newfoundland and Ireland, a German U-boat slips beneath the waves, its diesel engines ticking down to a whisper. Inside the conning tower, the air smells of oil, sweat, and stale bread. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Bauer presses his eye to the periscope. For hours, his crew has stalked a slow-moving Allied convoy. Fat merchant ships heavy with grain, fuel, and steel. Easy prey. Britain's lifeline. Then Bauer sees it. Not a destroyer, not a cruiser, not even something that looks properly naval. A small ship wallows in the waves, its bow plunging deep, then rising again like a cork in a storm. Short, squat, a single funnel, barely armed, painted grey, but somehow still looking civilian. Bauer lowers the periscope and smirks. A Corvette, he says. Laughter ripples through the control room. The Royal Navy, once ruler of the seas, is escorting its convoys with flower-named patrol boats. Ships inspired by whalers. Ships too slow to chase a submarine. Ships that roll so badly in heavy seas, their crews can barely stand. To German submariners, these vessels are a joke, a symbol of British desperation. Bauer raises the periscope again. The Corvette is closer now, pitching violently, its deck awash. Its speed is laughable, barely faster than the convoy it protects. The U-boat could slip away at will, or attack. Then the Corvette turns. Its movement is sudden, deliberate. The bow swings directly toward Bauer's position. A sharp ping slices through the water. ASDIC, sonar. The laughter stops. The U-boat dives hard. Valves slam. Men scramble. Depth gauges spin downward as the submarine plunges into the cold darkness. Moments later, the ocean explodes. The first depth charge detonates off the port side. A concussive hammer that rattles every bolt and weld. Lights flicker. Men are thrown against bulkheads. Another explosion follows, and another. The Corvette, the ridiculous little Corvette, is not leaving. For hours, it hunts. It circles patiently above. Slow but relentless. Each time Bauer tries to rise, more explosions drive the U-boat deeper. Batteries drain, carbon dioxide levels climb. The crew sweats in the freezing depths, nerves stretched thin. This is not how it was supposed to be. Just a year earlier, German U-boats ruled the Atlantic. They called it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Merchant ships burned by the dozens. Escorts were scarce. Britain was bleeding. Now, instead of vanishing between convoys, submarines are being shadowed, harassed, worn down. And at the center of this shift is the ship Bauer laughed at. The Flower-class Corvette. It was never meant to be glamorous. It was never meant to duel battleships or chase cruisers. It was designed in desperation, born from the realization that Britain did not need perfect ships. It needed enough ships. Small shipyards across Britain and Canada built them by the hundreds. Crews lived packed together in freezing steel boxes, seasick, exhausted, soaked day after day by icy spray. They called their ships the rolling coffins. They cursed them. They endured them. And yet, convoy by convoy, mile by mile, these tiny escorts closed the Atlantic. They did not win by speed. They did not win by firepower. They won by presence. Always there. Always listening. Always forcing U-boats to dive, to hide, to hesitate. German skippers would come to fear them. Not because they were powerful, but because they never went away. This is the story of the ships that were mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, and how they helped decide the most important naval battle of the Second World War. The Battle of the Atlantic. By the autumn of 1939, Britain was already fighting for survival, even before most of its people understood it. The British Isles could not feed themselves. They could not fuel themselves. They could not arm themselves without the sea. Every loaf of bread, every shell fired in France, every gallon of aviation fuel depended on ships crossing the Atlantic. And the men in Berlin knew it. German naval planners had learned a hard lesson in the First World War. Britain did not need to be invaded to be defeated. It only needed to be starved. Cut the sea lanes, and the empire would choke. At the center of that strategy was the submarine. Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat arm, believed submarines could succeed where surface fleets could not. Germany could never match Britain ship for ship, battleship for battleship, but U-boats were cheap, fast to build, deadly in the dark. Dönitz's doctrine was brutally simple. Attack merchant shipping faster than Britain could replace it. Tonnage war. In September 1939, when war began, Britain faced a terrifying imbalance. The Royal Navy was large, but it was spread across the globe, protecting colonies, trade routes, and imperial commitments from Singapore to the Mediterranean. Destroyers were tied down, escorting capital ships or hunting raiders. There were nowhere near enough escorts for every convoy. The Atlantic was vast. The ships were few. Early losses were manageable. Then came 1940. France collapsed in 6 weeks. Its Atlantic ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, fell into German hands. Suddenly, U-boats no longer had to make the long, dangerous journey from the North Sea. They could sail directly into the Atlantic. The killing ground moved closer. Convoys were attacked at night, on the surface, where U-boats were faster than their prey. Merchant sailors watched torpedoes streak toward them like glowing knives. Ships broke in half. Fires lit the ocean. Crews went into the water, often never to be seen again. By mid-1940, Britain was losing ships faster than it could replace them. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, later wrote that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. Not the Luftwaffe, not invasion, but the Atlantic. The problem was not courage or competence. It was numbers. A proper fleet destroyer was a complex machine, expensive, heavily armed, and time-consuming to build. Pre-war destroyers took years from keel to commissioning. Britain did not have years. Worse still, destroyers were overqualified for escort duty. They burned fuel at alarming rates. Their high speed was wasted creeping along at convoy pace. They required large crews and major shipyards. What Britain needed was not the perfect warship. It needed something else entirely. The escort crisis forced a painful realization. Most of the Atlantic War would not be fought by grand fleets or decisive battles. It would be fought by small ships plodding back and forth across grey water, listening, waiting, enduring. Convoy protection demanded vessels that could be built fast, in large numbers, by civilian yards. Ships that could stay at sea for weeks. Ships that could keep submarines submerged long enough to break an attack, even if they could not always destroy them. The Royal Navy had ignored this problem between the wars. Submarines were seen as a nuisance, not an existential threat. Anti-submarine warfare was underfunded. Sonar was crude. Depth charges were imprecise. Now the bill was coming due. Merchant losses climbed. In some months of 1940 and 1941, Britain lost hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. Every sinking rippled outward. Less food, fewer weapons, fewer tanks. This was not just a naval problem. It was a national emergency. Shipbuilders, admirals, and civil servants scrambled for solutions. New escort designs were sketched on paper, rejected, simplified, redrawn. Speed mattered more than elegance, practicality more than tradition. And slowly, reluctantly, the Royal Navy accepted an uncomfortable truth. To survive, Britain would have to fight the most important naval battle in its history, with ships that looked nothing like the proud grey silhouettes of the past. Ships that would be laughed at. Ships built not to win glory, but to buy time. Time for industry to mobilize. Time for technology to improve. Time for allies to join the fight. Out of that desperation, a small, blunt, unlovely vessel would emerge, one that embodied Britain's strategic gamble in the Atlantic. The Flower-class Corvette. The Flower-class Corvette was not designed in a grand naval office, nor born from years of careful planning. It was sketched out in a hurry, and that was the point. In 1939, with war looming, the Royal Navy faced a problem it could no longer postpone. It did not have enough escorts, and it could not build them fast enough. Traditional warship design was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. The answer came from an unexpected place. William Reed, chief designer at Smith's Dock Company in Middlesbrough, was not thinking about submarines when his design caught the Navy's eye. He was thinking about whales. His firm had recently designed a sturdy civilian whaling ship. Slow, simple, and tough. It was meant to operate in brutal seas, with minimal maintenance, far from home ports. Exactly the kind of qualities convoy escort demanded. The Admiralty took one look and saw possibility. Here was a hull that could be built by civilian shipyards. A ship with a reciprocating steam engine instead of complex turbines. A vessel that did not require highly trained crews or specialized docks. Most importantly, it could be built quickly. The design was adapted, stripped of anything unnecessary, and given a single mission: protect merchant ships from submarines. There would be no armor, no speed to speak of, no illusions about fighting surface ships. The Corvette's job was to escort, detect, and harass, not to chase or annihilate. Its name reflected that humility. Instead of proud naval titles, the ships were named after flowers: HMS Bluebell, HMS Snowdrop, HMS Buttercup. Some officers winced at the idea. Flower names felt soft, civilian, almost embarrassing, but the names stuck and soon became badges of endurance. The ships themselves were just over 200 feet long. They displaced about 900 tons. Their top speed barely reached 16 knots on a good day. In heavy seas, they rolled violently, earning a reputation as one of the most uncomfortable ships ever to serve. Crews would later joke that flowers were designed to roll on wet grass. Their armament was basic but functional: a single 4-inch gun on the bow, a few machine guns for defense, depth charges stacked on the stern like oversized grenades. And then there was ASDIC. Primitive sonar, by modern standards, but revolutionary for its time. It allowed corvettes to ping the water and detect submerged submarines, at least when sea conditions cooperated. Early versions were crude. Contacts were easily lost. False echoes were common. But ASDIC gave escorts something they had never truly possessed before: the ability to hunt below the surface. This was not a ship built to destroy U-boats in a single dramatic strike. It was built to deny them the surface, to force them down, to break their attacks, to protect the convoy long enough for it to escape. Production was the real miracle. Because the design was so simple, flowers could be built in small yards that had never produced warships before: fishing ports, river yards, and industrial towns across Britain, and soon across Canada, began turning out escorts at an astonishing pace. Canada, in particular, embraced the design. With limited naval infrastructure but vast industrial potential, Canadian shipyards became flower-class factories. Towns that had never seen a warship suddenly launched grey hulls destined for the North Atlantic. Many of the men who crewed them were reservists, fishermen, or civilians barely trained for naval war. They learned on the job, often under fire. The ships were not loved. They were cold. They were wet. They were cramped. Accommodation was so poor that early corvettes lacked proper living spaces. Crews slept wherever they could. Ventilation was awful. Condensation dripped from steel ceilings. In winter, ice formed inside the ship. And yet, they went to sea. Again and again. The Admiralty knew the design was flawed and accepted it. The Flower class was never intended to be the final answer to the submarine threat. It was a stopgap, a holding action in steel. But as convoys multiplied and losses mounted, something unexpected happened. The Corvette began to define the Atlantic War. Not because it was perfect, but because it existed in numbers. Every flower added to the escort screen meant another U-boat forced to dive. Another attack disrupted. Another convoy that arrived. Battered, delayed, but intact. German commanders scoffed at them. Allied sailors cursed them. But the Flower class filled the most dangerous gap of the war, and soon the men who laughed at them would learn that small, ugly ships could still be deadly. To the men of the German U-boat arm, the Flower class corvette looked like a mistake. U-boat commanders were professionals, trained to assess threats quickly. They respected British destroyers. Fast, aggressive, and dangerous. They knew cruisers and aircraft could be lethal. But the corvettes? They inspired something closer to amusement. German patrol reports and post-war memoirs are filled with dismissive language. The ships were described as small, slow, unsteady. Their single gun and shallow-depth charge racks seemed inadequate. In rough seas, they rolled so badly that accurate gunnery appeared impossible. To a submarine commander stalking a convoy at night, a Flower-class escort did not look like a hunter. It looked like an obstacle, and not a serious one. Early in the war, that assessment seemed justified. Flowers were inexperienced. Their crews were often barely trained. As deck operators struggled to maintain contact in heavy seas, depth charge patterns were poorly understood. Many early attacks failed to score hits. U-boats slipped away. Convoys burned. From the German perspective, the corvette was a nuisance, not a threat. A U-boat could surface at night, run faster than the escort, fire torpedoes, and vanish into darkness. Even if detected, the submarine could dive, absorb a few poorly placed depth charges, and escape. In 1940 and early 1941, the Atlantic still belonged to the hunters. But something was changing. The corvette's weakness was also its strength. It stayed with the convoy. Destroyers were often reassigned. Aircraft turned back at the edge of their range. But Flower-class ships remained, plodding along at merchant speed, never leaving the screen. German commanders noticed that even when Flowers failed to sink U-boats, they made attacks harder. Approaches took longer, firing solutions were rushed, surprise was lost, and time mattered. Early encounters began to follow a pattern. A U-boat would move into position, only to be forced down by sonar contact. It would surface hours later, batteries drained, only to find the convoy had moved on. No dramatic kill, no burning wreck, just failure. From the bridge of a U-boat, the corvette became something more irritating than dangerous, a persistent shadow. The real danger revealed itself during prolonged chases. A Flower-class corvette could not outrun a submarine, but it did not have to. Once it gained contact, it could remain above the U-boat, circling methodically, dropping depth charges at regular intervals. These attacks were rarely precise, but they were exhausting. Inside the submarine, each explosion shattered nerves. Even distant detonations loosened fittings, cracked gauges, and forced crews to make constant repairs. Men were thrown from bunks. Sleep became impossible. The corvette did not need to kill the submarine. It only needed to keep it submerged. German commanders began to report patrols ruined by a single small escort. Fuel wasted. Batteries depleted. Torpedoes never fired. And slowly, the laughter stopped. As 1941 wore on, convoy battles grew more complex. Flower-class ships began operating in groups, coordinating attacks. Training improved. As deck operators gained experience, depth charge patterns became more effective. The corvette was evolving. German skippers began to note something unsettling. The escorts were no longer breaking off pursuit. They were staying for hours, sometimes for days. What had once looked like an amateur fleet was becoming professional. The psychological shift was subtle but real. U-boat commanders could no longer assume that a small escort meant an easy attack. Each contact carried risk. Each ping meant delay. And delay was deadly in a war of tonnage. The Flower class had not yet turned the tide. but it had begun to change the rhythm of the fight. The Atlantic was no longer a place of quick, confident kills. It was becoming a place of attrition. And the ships at the center of that change were the ones nobody had taken seriously. In 1939, the Flower-class Corvette was supposed to be temporary, a stopgap, a compromise, a way to survive the early years of the war until better ships could be built. No one expected it to become the backbone of the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet year by year, convoy by convoy, that is exactly what happened. 1939, an emergency measure. The first Flower-class corvettes entered service just as war broke out. They were rushed through trials and sent straight to sea. Crews trained while escorting convoys. Mistakes were common, so were losses. But every Flower commissioned was another escort on the line. Another gap closed. Early convoys were thinly protected. A single corvette might guard dozens of merchant ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was not enough, but it was better than nothing. And better than nothing was suddenly priceless. 1940. Expansion under fire. The fall of France changed everything. U-boats surged into the Atlantic from captured ports, and losses skyrocketed. Britain responded with sheer industrial effort. Orders for corvettes multiplied. Shipyards worked around the clock. Flowers began to appear everywhere, in the western approaches, the North Sea, and the icy waters off Canada. Canada's role became decisive. With its coastline facing the Atlantic and shipyards hungry for work, it rapidly expanded production. Canadian flowers were often rougher than their British counterparts, but they arrived in numbers, and numbers mattered more than finish. By the end of 1940, the Flower class was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a system. 1941. Learning the fight. This was the year the Corvette grew up. Training improved. Escort groups were formalized. Ships stopped operating as lonely sentinels and began working as coordinated teams. Technology followed experience. Early Flowers had short forecastles that left decks constantly awash. Later modifications extended the forecastle, improving seaworthiness and crew comfort. Slightly. Radar began to appear, crude but revolutionary. For the first time, escorts could detect surfaced U-boats at night when most attacks occurred. Depth charge capacity increased. Patterns became deliberate instead of improvised. Crews learned how to box a submarine in, forcing it deeper with each pass. The Corvette was still slow, still uncomfortable, still outmatched on paper. But it was no longer naive. 1942, the breaking point. If 1941 was a year of learning, 1942 was a year of pain. When the United States entered the war, its coastline became a killing ground. Unescorted shipping burned within sight of American cities. U-boats called it a second happy time. Once again, the Flower class was asked to hold the line. Canadian and British corvettes pushed west, extending convoy protection farther into the Atlantic. Escort ranges expanded. The air gap, the deadly zone beyond aircraft coverage, shrank slowly, painfully. Flowers bore the brunt of the fight. They escorted convoys through storms, ice, and near constant attack. Losses were heavy. Crews rotated out exhausted, only to be replaced by men just as green. And still, the corvettes went back to sea. 1943. From backbone to shield. By early 1943, the Atlantic War reached its climax. This time, the outcome was different. The Flower class was no longer alone. New escorts, frigates, destroyer escorts, long-range aircraft joined the fight. But Flowers remained everywhere, filling gaps, reinforcing groups, refusing to leave convoys uncovered. Technology now favored the escorts, improved radar, better sonar, more effective depth charges, coordinated hunter-killer tactics. Wolf packs that once attacked with confidence now ran into layered defenses. And at the center of those defenses were the ships that had been built first, fastest, and in the greatest numbers. The Flower-class Corvette had become indispensable. By mid-1943, U-boat losses spiked catastrophically. German commanders withdrew from the North Atlantic, conceding defeat. The Corvette did not win the battle alone, but without it, there would have been no battle left to win. What began as an emergency measure had become the quiet foundation of Allied victory at sea. For years, the Battle of the Atlantic had followed a grim pattern. U-boats struck, convoys scattered, escorts arrived too late, or not at all. What finally broke that cycle was not a single invention or battle, but a series of turning points that slowly shifted the balance. And running through all of them was the steady, unglamorous presence of the Flower-class corvette. The first turning point was continuity. Before the Corvette, convoy protection came in fragments. Merchant ships were escorted close to port, then left alone in the open ocean, only to be picked up again near their destination. The middle of the Atlantic, the air gap, was a killing field. Flowers changed that. They were designed not for speed, but for endurance. They could remain with the convoy from departure to arrival. No handoffs, no exposed intervals. For the first time, convoys were truly escorted across the ocean. That alone transformed the war. A U-boat forced to attack an escorted convoy had fewer options. Surprise was harder. Attacks took longer. Escorts were already in position. The second turning point was forcing the dive. Submarines were most effective on the surface. They were faster. They could see. They could maneuver freely. The Flower-class corvette's greatest achievement was denying U-boats that freedom. ASDIC did not need to be perfect. It only needed to make contact. Each sonar ping forced a submarine commander to make a decision. Dive or risk detection. Most dived. Once submerged, a U-boat was slow, blind, and burning precious battery power. Every minute underwater brought it closer to retreat. Flowers made the Atlantic three-dimensional and deadly below the surface. The third turning point was persistence. Destroyers were fast and lethal, but they could not linger. Fuel constraints and competing missions pulled them away. Corvettes had no such expectations. They stayed. A flower would remain on station, circling above a suspected contact hour after hour, even when the chances of a kill were slim. Depth charges were dropped, not as a finishing blow, but as a pressure tactic. German crews called it Dauerjagd, the endless hunt. Exhaustion became a weapon. The fourth turning point was teamwork. Early in the war, escorts acted independently. By 1942, they operated as coordinated groups. One ship held sonar contact while another attacked. Flowers worked alongside destroyers and frigates, filling gaps and maintaining pressure. The corvette's role was no longer solitary. It was systemic. The fifth turning point was technology catching up to doctrine. Radar transformed night fighting. High-frequency direction finding. HFTUF located U-boat radio transmissions. Improved depth charges and tactics increased kill rates. These tools mattered, but they only worked because escorts were already in place. Canadian and British corvettes pushed west, extending convoy protection farther into the Atlantic. Escort ranges expanded. The air gap, the deadly zone beyond aircraft coverage, shrank slowly, painfully. Flowers bore the brunt of the fight. They escorted convoys through storms, ice, and near constant attack. Losses were heavy. Crews rotated out exhausted, only to be replaced by men just as green. And still, the corvettes went back to sea. 1940. From backbone to shield. Technology without ships is theory. Ships without technology is courage. The Flower class provided the ships. By early 1943, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Convoys were no longer soft targets. Attacks failed more often than they succeeded. U-boats were being sunk at a rate Germany could not sustain. Wolfpacks began to dissolve under pressure. Survivors reported constant harassment. No rest, no safety. The Atlantic had turned hostile. the Flower class did not deliver a single dramatic blow that could be pointed to on a map. Its victory was quieter, slower, and far more decisive. It turned the ocean itself into a defensive weapon. And once that happened, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Life aboard a Flower-class corvette was not heroic in the way war posters imagined it. It was cold, it was wet, and it never stopped moving. From the moment a corvette cleared harbor, the ship began to roll, a slow, relentless motion that twisted stomachs and exhausted muscles. In winter, waves broke over the bow and froze where they landed. Ice formed on rails, guns, even inside passageways. 90 men lived packed into a steel box designed for half that number. There was little privacy and less comfort. Hammocks were slung wherever space allowed. Clothing was perpetually damp. The smell of fuel oil mixed with sweat, food, and unwashed bodies. Sleep came in fragments, if it came at all. For weeks at a time, crews lived at action stations, waiting for the sound that mattered most. The ping. An ASDIC contact could come at any moment. A single sharp echo in the headphones, followed by the call every man both dreaded and welcomed. Contact ahead. When it happened, routine vanished. Engines surged. The ship heeled as it turned into the attack. Depth charges were armed. The 4-inch gun crew stood by, scanning the waves. Down below, the ASDIC operator tracked the ghost beneath the water, calling out range and bearing. The entire ship seemed to hold its breath. Then the charges rolled off the stern. Explosions hammered the hull. The sea erupted. Foam and oil rose to the surface. Sometimes a sign of damage, sometimes a cruel illusion. Most attacks ended in uncertainty. No wreckage, no survivors, just silence. And then the waiting began again. Convoy battles were not single moments of violence, they were marathons. A U-boat pack might stalk a convoy for days, probing for weakness. Escorts responded with constant vigilance. Crews rotated through watches, nerves fraying with each hour. Men learned to live with fear, and to function anyway. In one typical Atlantic battle, a Flower-class corvette detected a submarine shortly after dusk. The escort group maneuvered to intercept, forcing the U-boat down. For the next 16 hours, the corvette maintained contact, dropping depth charges whenever the submarine tried to rise. 16 hours of explosions, 16 hours of tension. The submarine escaped, but it never attacked. That was a victory. These were the victories that never made headlines. For merchant crews, the corvette was a lifeline. Sailors watched the small grey ships with gratitude bordering on superstition. When a flower appeared on the horizon, morale lifted. Someone was watching. Someone would respond. Corvette crews felt that responsibility keenly. They knew what happened when escorts failed. They had seen the aftermath. Burning oil, lifeboats drifting in heavy seas, men calling for help that could not always be given. Rescue was dangerous. Stopping made escorts vulnerable. Yet flowers pulled survivors from the water whenever they could, even under threat of attack. These moments stayed with crews long after the war. There were losses too. Corvettes were sunk by torpedoes, mines, and aircraft. When a flower went down, survival chances were slim. The North Atlantic did not forgive mistakes. Crews watched sister ships disappear in explosions and foam, knowing their turn might come next. And still, they sailed. There were no aces aboard corvettes. No individual scores tallied in newspapers. The war they fought was collective, anonymous, relentless. Victory came not from brilliance, but from endurance. Men aged years in months. Letters from home arrived late, or not at all. News came in fragments. Time lost meaning between ports. Yet bonds formed that lasted a lifetime. Years later, veterans would struggle to explain what the war had felt like. Not terror, not exactly. More like tension stretched so thin it became normal. The Flower-class corvette was not a stage for glory. It was a place where ordinary men did extraordinary things because there was no alternative. And through their endurance, convoy by convoy, they wore down the enemy. Not with drama, but with persistence. For the men inside Germany's U-boats, the Atlantic War changed in ways that were not always visible on a map. At first, submarine warfare was exhilarating. Early patrols brought success, recognition, and a sense of mastery. Crews returned to base to applause, music, and medals. Commanders became celebrities. But as the escort net tightened, that confidence began to erode. The Flower-class corvette played a central role in that shift. Not as a dramatic killer, but as a constant source of pressure. U-boat crews learned to fear the ping. It meant they had been found. It meant they were no longer in control. Depth charges did not need to hit to do damage. Each explosion shook the hull, loosened bolts, cracked pipes, and shattered nerves. Even near misses could disable equipment or cause leaks that had to be patched in darkness and silence. The worst part was uncertainty. A submarine under attack could not see its enemy. It could only listen. To the sonar, to the screws above, to the muffled thunder of explosions. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Flowers made this worse by refusing to disengage. German commanders reported escorts that stayed overhead for half a day or more, denying the submarine the chance to surface and recharge. Air grew stale. Carbon dioxide levels climbed. Men became dizzy and irritable. Discipline frayed. Sleep was impossible. The Corvette became a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one where endurance mattered more than boldness. As losses mounted, morale declined. The happy time gave way to a grim routine of patrols that achieved little and risked everything. Crews joked darkly about their chances of survival. New submariners noticed how veterans grew quieter with each patrol. The Atlantic no longer felt like a hunting ground. It felt like a trap. By 1943, fear had become institutional. Training emphasized caution. Patrols grew shorter. Attacks were aborted at the first sign of detection. Wolf packs hesitated. The Corvette had reshaped behavior. U-boat commanders began to see escorts everywhere, even when none were present. The psychological pressure outpaced the physical threat. Germany could build submarines faster than Britain could build escorts. But it could not replace trained crews. And those crews were breaking under the strain. The Flower-class corvette, humble and uncelebrated, had become one of the most effective weapons in the Atlantic. Not because it destroyed submarines in great numbers, but because it made every patrol feel like a gamble that could not be won. The Battle of the Atlantic was never about sinking every U-boat. It was about keeping Britain alive long enough to win the war. Measured by that standard, the Flower-class corvette was one of the most strategically important ships of the Second World War. Its value lay not in dramatic victories, but in arithmetic. Every convoy that arrived meant food on British tables, fuel in British tanks, and weapons in British hands. Every month Britain survived brought new factories online, new aircraft into service, and eventually new allies fully committed to the fight. The Corvette made that possible. Strategically, the Flower-class changed the Atlantic War in 3 decisive ways. First, it closed the gaps. Before the Corvette, escort coverage was inconsistent and fragile. Destroyers were pulled away. Aircraft ran out of range. Convoys spent days exposed. Flowers erased those gaps. They made continuous escort the norm rather than the exception. Even when no U-boats were sunk, attacks were disrupted, delayed, or abandoned. The convoy system, once theoretical, became operational. This alone reduced losses enough to keep Britain functioning. Second, it bought time. Time was the Allies' most valuable resource. The Flower-class was never meant to be the final solution to submarine warfare. It was meant to hold the line until better ships, better aircraft, and better technology arrived. And it succeeded. While corvettes patrolled the Atlantic, scientists improved radar and sonar. Shipyards built frigates and escort carriers. Long-range aircraft closed the air gap. American industry mobilized on a scale Germany could not match. None of that mattered if Britain collapsed in 1941 or 1942. The Corvette ensured it did not. Third, it forced Germany into a losing strategy. U-boat warfare relied on surprise, freedom of movement, and psychological dominance. The Flower class undermined all three. By forcing submarines to remain submerged, corvettes reduced their effectiveness. By staying with convoys, they removed easy targets. By maintaining pressure, they drained morale. Germany responded by building more submarines, but quantity without freedom became meaningless. Losses rose. Crews died faster than they could be trained. By 1943, the U-boat arm was bleeding itself white. The strategic decision had already been made. The Atlantic was no longer Germany's battlefield. It belonged to the Escorts. This mattered far beyond the sea. The survival of Atlantic convoys enabled the build-up for D-Day. It allowed American troops and equipment to cross safely. It sustained the Soviet Union through Arctic convoys. It supported every Allied front. The corvette's contribution was invisible, and therefore easy to overlook. But remove it, and the war's timeline collapses. No secure Atlantic meant no invasion of Europe. No sustained bombing campaign. No global logistics. The Flower-class corvette did not win the war by itself, but without it, the war could not have been won. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Flower-class corvette had no victory parade waiting for it. There were no grand ceremonies, no famous photographs, no monuments rising over harbors in its name. The war had moved on. Hundreds of Flower-class ships were quickly declared surplus. Some were sold, some were scrapped. Others were converted into civilian vessels, freighters, weather ships, even pleasure craft. Their grey paint vanished beneath commercial colors. The crews went home. Many carried the war with them in quiet ways. Sleeplessness, a permanent sensitivity to noise, memories of storms and explosions that never truly faded. They returned to civilian life without fanfare, their service largely invisible to the public. History followed the same pattern. The Flower-class corvette never captured popular imagination. It lacked the speed of destroyers, the power of battleships, the drama of aircraft carriers. It was not built for duels or decisive moments. And yet, its legacy is profound. The Flower class proved that wars are not only won by the best weapons, but by the right ones. It showed that endurance, mass production, and presence could matter more than elegance or raw power. It also reshaped naval thinking. Post-war escort design emphasized range, habitability, and anti-submarine specialization, lessons written in the rolling decks of corvettes. The modern concept of layered convoy defense owes much to these small ships. Perhaps most importantly, the Flower class embodied a truth often forgotten in histories of war. Victory is usually decided long before the final battle. It is decided in supply lines held open, in nights survived, in ships that stay on station when everyone else would rather leave. The German skippers who laughed at the Flower class learned that lesson the hard way. They laughed at ships that were too small, too slow, too ugly to matter. Until those ships were everywhere, until the Atlantic closed around them, until the laughter stopped.